Imagine discovering that the person you love the most, the one who has always been by your side, is being mistreated at the most vulnerable moment of their life. What would you do if you suspected that the care in a hospital, which should be about protection and healing, has turned into a real nightmare? Clara, a strong and determined woman, finds herself in a devastating dilemma when she begins to suspect that her brother, Miguel, on the brink of death, is not receiving the care he deserves. In a desperate search for answers, she makes a decision that will change everything. This is a story filled with emotion, suspense, and twists, where fraternal love and the fight for justice face unimaginable obstacles. Each chapter reveals deeper secrets and places Clara on a journey that will test her limits and courage. If you're curious to know how this story unfolds and want to follow other intense and emotional narratives like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Here, you will find videos that will captivate your attention and stir your emotions. Don't miss out. Hit the notification bell to be alerted whenever a new video is uploaded. Join us on this journey of stories that touch the heart and challenge the spirit. Woman installs camera in her brother's hospital room while he is on the brink of death. What they did to him broke everyone's hearts. The clock read 3 in the afternoon, but time seemed to have lost its meaning for Clara. In the cold and impersonal hospital corridor, the constant rhythmic sound of heart monitors echoed in her ears, mingled with the hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses. The lifeless white walls reflected her anguish, as if the very environment was steeped in the pain and uncertainty that consumed her. Clara was a strong, determined woman, but at that moment, the vulnerability she had always avoided showing threatened to break through the barriers she had carefully built throughout her life. Since her younger brother, Miguel, was hospitalized, Clara felt as if she was trapped in an endless nightmare. Miguel was more than just a brother to her. He was her anchor, her confidant, the only person who truly understood the depth of the scars life had inflicted on them. They had lost their parents at a very young age, victims of a tragic accident, and since then, Clara had taken it upon herself to care for Miguel. Despite the many challenges, they had always faced everything together, united by a bond that transcended blood. Miguel had always been a sensitive and kind soul, with a passion for life that Clara deeply admired. While she became tough and resilient, sculpted by adversity, Miguel maintained a pure heart, never allowing the cruelty of the world to corrupt him. Clara loved him for that, and perhaps that's why she felt such overwhelming fear when she saw him in that hospital bed, pale and fragile, with life slipping away with each labored breath. The diagnosis was a devastating blow, a rare and aggressive disease that quickly brought him to a critical state. The first weeks were a roller coaster of hope and despair, with doctors alternating between cautious optimism and brutal realism. But in recent weeks, something changed. Clara began to notice signs that deeply troubled her. Miguel, who had previously shown small signs of improvement, now seemed to deteriorate with each passing day. The unexplained bruises that appeared on his arms, the lethargy that enveloped him like a shadow, the silent despair in his eyes, all of this fueled a growing unease in Clara. She no longer trusted the hospital, the doctors who spoke with complicated words and eyes that avoided hers, the nurses who seemed more concerned with keeping schedules than caring for Miguel. There was a coldness, a distance in the way they treated Miguel that made her uneasy. More than once, Clara caught nurses exchanging furtive glances, as if they knew something they weren't willing to share. The feeling of helplessness was eating her alive. Clara was a woman of action, someone who had always known what to do, but there, in the hospital, she felt disarmed, powerless. Yet, the idea of giving up never crossed her mind. She knew she had to do something, anything, to protect her brother. And then, one lonely night, sitting beside Miguel's bed, the idea came to her. The idea initially seemed extreme, perhaps even paranoid, but the more she thought about it, the more Clara was convinced it was the only way to uncover the truth. If Miguel was being mistreated, if something was happening to him out of her sight, she would need proof. Proof that could be used to save her brother, to confront those responsible, to bring justice. Clara spent that night wide awake, planning. It wasn't easy. but she knew she had to be careful. The next day, she did some quick research and bought a small camera, the kind that could be easily hidden in any ordinary object. When she finally returned to the hospital, Clara's heart was beating so fast she feared everyone around her could hear it. She waited until the nurse on duty left the room to change shifts. With trembling but determined hands, she hid the camera in a discreet corner, from where it could capture the entire view of Miguel's bed and the surrounding area. When she finished, Clara felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She knew she had taken the first step, but she also knew that what would come next could be even more disturbing. It was an agonizing wait, but Clara was ready for anything. Or at least she thought she was. She could never have imagined what that camera would reveal, the dark truths and secrets that were about to be unearthed. That night, as she left the hospital, Clara took one last look at Miguel before walking out. He was so still, so silent, that for a brief moment, fear hit her like a wave. The fear that, perhaps, when she returned, he might no longer be there. But she shook the thought away, forcing herself to believe that somehow they would still have time. Time to fight, time to say goodbye, time to understand what was happening. The pain in Clara's chest was almost unbearable, but there was a flame of determination in her eyes. She would do whatever it took to protect Miguel, even if it meant confronting the darkest aspects of that place. The first step had been taken. Now, she just needed to wait and prepare for whatever came next. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she inserted the memory card into the computer. Her heart, heavy with anxiety, beat so hard she could feel it pulsing in her throat. The mouse cursor hovered over the folder of newly captured videos, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. She had avoided looking at the recordings until now, fearing what she might find. Logic dictated that it was necessary, that she needed to know the truth, but her heart shrank with dread at what she was about to see. The folder opened, revealing a series of files, each marked with the exact time they were recorded. Every second felt like an eternity as she clicked on the first video. The screen filled with the familiar image of Miguel's hospital room, and for a brief moment, Clara hesitated, almost wishing that nothing was wrong, that her fears were unfounded. But as the minutes passed and the quiet morning hospital routine unfolded, something changed. Clara watched as a nurse entered the room. He seemed nonchalant, lacking the urgency or attentiveness that Clara would expect from someone caring for such a critical patient. The nurse quickly checked the monitors with an evident expression of boredom. But it was what happened next that made Clara's stomach churn. The nurse glanced around, ensuring he was alone, and then, with a swift and cruel gesture, squeezed Miguel's arm forcefully. Miguel's face contorted in pain, but he was too weak to even protest. Clara held her breath, unable to believe what she was seeing. As if that wasn't enough, the nurse leaned over Miguel, whispering something in his ear, something the camera didn't capture clearly, but which brought tears to Clara's eyes. She fast-forwarded the video, trying to determine if that horrifying act was an exception or part of a pattern. What she saw in the following minutes made her blood run cold. Other staff members entered the room throughout the day, and the neglect was apparent. Sometimes they completely ignored Miguel, leaving him for long periods without checking. Other times, they performed procedures carelessly, almost as if they were in a hurry to finish. One of them, visibly irritated, even shoved Miguel's bed forcefully, as if the patient were an inconvenience. Clara felt each scene like a direct blow to her heart. She couldn't believe that people responsible for caring for human lives could be so cruel. The indifference on their faces, the way they treated Miguel as if he were a worthless object, it was unbearable. The worst part, however, was when one of the nurses, upon leaving the room, made a sarcastic comment to a colleague in the hallway, saying it wasn't worth wasting time on a lost cause like Miguel. The video ended, and Clara sat paralyzed, staring at the darkened computer screen. The room around her seemed to spin, and the pain in her chest was so intense that she could barely breathe. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, fear. She wanted to scream, to run back to the hospital and confront each one of those people, to drag Miguel out of there and protect him from the cruelty he was suffering. But then reality hit her like a cold splash of water. What could she do? If Clara confronted the hospital now, she might make things worse. And if exposing what she discovered led the abusers to retaliate against Miguel, accelerating what already seemed like an inevitable fate? And if, by acting, she lost the only chance to save her brother? Clara sank into the chair, covering her face with her hands. She felt torn between the urgency to protect Miguel and the paralyzing fear that any misstep could seal his fate. Every possibility seemed to lead to a bottomless abyss. And yet, Clara knew she couldn't just stand by, waiting for something worse to happen. She needed to be strategic. She needed a plan. But time was running out, and every minute Miguel spent in that hospital was a torment for her. Clara stood up abruptly, the chair rolling back with force. A decision began to form in her mind, a desperate and daring plan that might be her only chance to save Miguel. First, she needed more evidence, something she could use to ensure that the responsible parties were not only punished, but also that Miguel was transferred to a place where he would truly receive the care he needed. Clara decided she would need to record a few more days, capture more irrefutable evidence. But time was essential, and meanwhile, Miguel needed to survive. Clara knew she couldn't tell anyone, not yet. Every move had to be made with extreme caution. Any sign that she was investigating could alert the responsible parties, and then Miguel would be in immediate danger. The courage Clara always had would now need to be stronger than ever. That night, as she reviewed the recordings and made detailed notes, Clara cried silently. Every tear was a mix of pain and determination, for she knew that no matter how difficult it was, she would not give up. No matter what it took, she would save her brother. The secret was revealed, and now Clara was ready to act, with all the strength she had left, with all the cunning her pain could conjure. Clara's fight was just beginning, and in that silent war unfolding in the hospital's white corridors, she prepared to fight with all her might, driven by the unwavering love she felt for Miguel and the certainty that, as long as he had life, she would not rest. The sun had barely risen on the horizon when Clara decided she could no longer bear the weight of the secret alone. The previous night had been a storm of restless thoughts and nightmares, with the images from the recordings replaying incessantly in her mind. Clara knew she needed to act quickly, but she also knew she would need support to confront the hospital system that seemed to be failing so cruelly. With a heavy heart, Clara mentally listed those she could trust at that moment. Her parents had passed away a few years ago, leaving only Clara and Miguel as the last direct family members. But there were some distant uncles and cousins, as well as friends who had always been by their side, especially during the toughest times. Clara decided to start with those who had a closer connection to Miguel, those who, like her, would be devastated to know the truth. The first call was to Anna, Clara and Miguel's closest cousin. Anna had always been like a sister to them, a constant and affectionate presence who never left them alone in difficult times. When Clara briefly explained what she had discovered and asked Anna to come to her house, her cousin's tone immediately changed. Anna didn't ask for many details, but Clara could hear the concern and urgency in her voice as she promised to arrive as soon as possible. After Anna, Clara called Mateo, a childhood friend who had grown up alongside Miguel. They were inseparable, and Mateo had always been seen as part of the family. Like Anna, Mateo didn't hesitate to respond to Clara's call, recognizing the seriousness in her voice. He also promised to be there as soon as possible. As Clara continued making calls, her anxiety increased. She knew she was about to unleash a storm of emotions, but she saw no other alternative. Her brother was suffering, and those who were supposed to care for him were, in fact, causing more pain. She needed allies, needed others to see what she saw and help decide what to do next. Soon, Clara's room was filled with people she trusted with her life. Anna arrived first, her eyes already red from uncried tears as she hugged Clara tightly. Next, Mateo appeared, his expression grim and determination visible in every step he took. Other friends and family arrived shortly after, creating a tense atmosphere of anticipation in the room. Clara stood before them, her gaze grave and determined. With a deep breath, she began to speak, explaining in detail everything she had discovered. As she recounted the events, the looks around her grew more shocked and incredulous. Some people whispered among themselves, trying to process the horror of what they were hearing. But it was when Clara played the video and the scenes began to unfold on the screen that the true devastation hit the group. There were screams of shock, tears streaming down stunned faces, and some people had to look away, unable to bear what they were seeing. Anna cried openly, her hand covering her mouth as she watched Miguel's suffering and the inhumane treatment he received. Mateo clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his body trembling with anger and helplessness. Other friends and family reacted similarly, their anger, sadness, and indignation mixing in a whirlwind of emotions. When the video ended, the room fell into a deathly silence. No one knew what to say, all absorbed in the impact of what they had just witnessed. It was Anna who finally broke the silence, her voice hoarse from crying, but laden with contained fury. "This cannot go unpunished, Clara. They need to pay for this. We need to do something." Anna's words echoed in everyone's hearts, and Clara felt a sudden relief in realizing she was no longer alone in this fight. But at the same time, the reality of the situation was frightening. Clara knew that confronting a hospital, especially one that had already shown so much neglect, would not be easy. And there's the lingering fear that any misstep could result in even more terrible consequences for Miguel. Clara shook her head, agreeing with Anna. "I know, Anna. I know. But we need to be careful. Miguel, he doesn't have much time. We need to do this the right way, without alerting these people so they can't do anything worse." Mateo, still shaking with rage, stood up abruptly. "Let's go to the hospital now. Let's confront them directly." Clara looked at Mateo, pain evident in her eyes. "I want that too, Mateo. But we have to think about Miguel. We need more concrete evidence, something we can use to protect him while exposing these monsters." It was then that Isabella, a family friend who worked as a lawyer, suggested, "We can involve the authorities. Take this to the police, and if they don't act quickly enough, we can go to the press. But either way, we need to protect Miguel immediately." The mention of the police and the press brought a new level of urgency to the situation. Everyone knew that a public accusation could be risky, but also that it might be the only way to ensure Miguel's situation was taken seriously. Clara felt a lump in her throat at the thought of exposing Miguel and the family in such a way, but she knew it was necessary. If they didn't act quickly, it might be too late. The decision was made. Clara and Isabella would go to the police station that very afternoon, bringing the recordings as evidence. Meanwhile, Mateo and Anna would stay at the hospital, keeping a vigilant eye on Miguel and documenting any suspicious activity. Clara would also contact a local news agency, should the police not act with the needed urgency. As the afternoon progressed and the plan began to unfold, Clara felt the mix of fear and determination intensify within her. She knew that the battle they were about to face would be tough, and Miguel's time was rapidly running out. But Clara was ready to fight with everything she had. She wouldn't rest until those who had wronged her brother were brought to justice, and Miguel was placed somewhere he would receive the care and respect he deserved. The fight for justice began now, and Clara was determined to win, no matter what she had to sacrifice to achieve it. The hospital was engulfed in an unsettling silence as Clara walked through the corridors, her mind heavy with the mission that awaited her. The police had promised to investigate the case, but the process would be slow. The authorities wanted more evidence, more witnesses, more time. But time was something Clara didn't have. Every passing minute seemed to drain more life from Miguel, and Clara knew that if she didn't act quickly, she might lose him forever. When Clara arrived at Miguel's room, she found Anna and Mateo waiting outside, their expressions laden with worry. Anna was the first to speak, her voice low and tense. "Clara, something isn't right. He looks worse than before. And I think they know about the camera." Clara's heart sank. The thought that someone might have discovered the camera terrified her. If it were true, everything she had done could have put Miguel's life in even greater danger. She entered the room, trying to brace herself for what she would find, but nothing could have prepared her for the sight that awaited her. Miguel lay in bed, pale as a sheet. struggling to breathe. The rhythmic sound of the machine seemed weaker, more unstable. Clara approached, tears forming in her eyes as she saw her brother's condition. The strong, vibrant man she knew seemed to be fading before her eyes, leaving only a fragile, broken shadow. Clara squeezed Miguel's hand, feeling his cold, lifeless skin, and whispered with a trembling voice, "Miguel, please hang in there. I'm here. I'm going to save you, I promise." But there was something different in that room, something dark and threatening that Clara couldn't identify. She looked around, trying to understand what was wrong. The nursing staff seemed more distant, colder than ever. The glances were harsh, almost challenging, as if they were waiting for her to confront something. The atmosphere was charged with tension, as if a storm was about to erupt at any moment. Then Clara noticed the camera, or rather, the absence of it. The camera she had carefully hidden was gone, and in the place where it should have been, there was only a small smudge of dirt. Panic took over her. Someone had discovered the camera, someone who was now playing a dangerous and deadly game with Miguel's life. She hurried out of the room, finding Mateo and Anna waiting outside. "They know," she said, her voice filled with despair. "The camera, it's gone." Mateo frowned, anger growing within him. "We need to do something now, Clara. We can't wait any longer. They're trying to hide the truth, and Miguel is paying the price." Clara knew he was right, but the fear of losing Miguel paralyzed her. She wanted to act, to expose everything, but she knew she was racing against time. Whatever those nurses were doing, it was working because Miguel was worsening rapidly. She felt powerless, as if she were fighting against an invisible force determined to snatch her brother's life away. The day dragged on like an endless nightmare. Clara, Anna, and Mateo tried everything to get help, but each attempt was thwarted by indifferent bureaucracy and a hospital staff that now seemed hostile. With each passing second, Clara felt Miguel slipping further and further away, as if he were slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. By nightfall, the situation became untenable. Miguel began to have seizures, his body writhing in pain, while Clara watched helplessly. The machines began to beep uncontrollably, and the medical team finally rushed into the room. But Clara no longer trusted them. She knew something was wrong, that what was happening was not just the natural course of Miguel's illness. She tried to hold his hand, attempting to offer some comfort, but was pushed out of the room as the doctors and nurses took over. The last thing she saw before being removed was the vacant look in Miguel's eyes, as if he had already given up. Clara was taken to a waiting room, where she collapsed into a chair, her heart heavy with the certainty that something terrible was about to happen. Anna and Mateo were beside her, trying to offer some comfort, but Clara was beyond consolation. She knew, deep in her soul, that she was about to lose her brother, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The minutes dragged on in agonizing silence until a doctor appeared at the door of the waiting room. He looked dejected, his face tired, but his eyes avoided Clara's. She knew what he was going to say before he even opened his mouth. "I'm so sorry. We did everything we could, but Miguel didn't make it." The words pierced Clara like a knife, and she felt the world around her collapse. Miguel, her dear brother, was dead. She had failed. All her effort, all her fight, and in the end, it wasn't enough. The cry of pain she let out was so deep and primal that it seemed to echo through the hospital walls. Anna and Mateo tried to hold her back, but Clara was inconsolable. The grief of the loss was overwhelming, and the guilt that followed was even worse. She had placed that camera, she had tried to protect Miguel, but in the end, it was what killed him. The hospital staff, realizing they were being monitored, had retaliated in a way Clara could never have imagined. Of course, the hospital tried to cover everything up. They claimed Miguel's death was a natural result of his condition, that they had done everything they could. But Clara knew the truth. She knew that, somehow, her attempt to protect her brother had led to his death. In the depths of her shattered heart, Clara made a vow. They might try to cover up whatever they wanted, but she would not give up. She would fight to the end, until everyone knew what really happened. Even if it meant destroying herself in the process, Clara was determined to expose the truth and bring justice for Miguel. He might be dead, but her fight was far from over. The city, once indifferent, was swept by a wave of indignation that spread rapidly like wildfire. Clara knew she was fighting a battle she could not afford to lose. When she finally managed to bring the recordings to the media, the impact was immediate. The disturbing images Clara had captured were broadcast on news channels, provoking a furious public reaction. The public demanded answers, and the pressure on the hospital became unbearable. The streets outside the hospital filled with protesters, ordinary people who came together to demand justice for Miguel and for all those who might have been victims of neglect and cruelty. Social media was abuzz with discussions, and Miguel's name became a symbol of the fight for changes in the healthcare system. Clara watched all this with a mixture of relief and sadness. Her brother's death had finally exposed the truth, but at what cost? The authorities could not ignore the public outcry. Within days, an investigation was launched, and the hospital's administration was placed under intense scrutiny. Clara was called to testify, her words filled with emotion and determination. She recounted every detail, from the initial suspicions to the moment she discovered the missing camera and the tragic death of Miguel that followed. The hospital, in turn, tried to defend itself. They claimed the images had been misinterpreted, that the staff's behavior was a result of stress and intense pressure. But nothing could erase what the cameras had revealed. The cold and indifferent cruelty, the disregard for Miguel's life, was forever etched in the minds of everyone who saw those images. Soon, the consequences began to unfold. Several members of the hospital staff were fired, and some faced criminal charges. The hospital director resigned, while other members of the administration were suspended as investigations continued. Clara, however, found no solace in these victories. None of this would bring Miguel back, and the pain of his loss continued to haunt her. But amidst all this turmoil, Clara began to realize something deeper. Miguel's fight had not been in vain. His death had exposed the systemic flaws of a healthcare system that often treated patients as numbers rather than human beings. She realized that Miguel, in his death, had ignited a spark of change that she could not let extinguish. Reflection took over Clara in the days that followed. She spent sleepless nights turning over in her mind what had happened and what could be done to prevent other families from suffering the same fate. She thought of Miguel, of his kindness, of his fight for life, and knew she could not simply move on. He deserved more than that. His memory could not be reduced to a tragedy. It was then that Clara made a decision. She would use Miguel's name for something greater, something that could make a difference in the lives of others. With the support of friends, family, and even strangers touched by Miguel's story, Clara began to sketch out the initial plans for creating a foundation. The Miguel Foundation was officially launched 6 months after his death. The launch event was small but full of emotion. Clara gave a speech, her voice strong but trembling with emotion, as she spoke about the brother she had lost and the promise she had made to him to ensure that his death would not be in vain. She explained that the foundation would be dedicated to monitoring the quality of hospital care, supporting families who suspected neglect, and fighting for reforms in the healthcare system. The Miguel Foundation quickly gained traction. With media support and activist backing, Clara managed to gather resources and attract dedicated professionals to the cause. The foundation began working closely with other patient rights advocacy groups, creating a support network for those in need. They investigated claims of neglect, provided legal and psychological support to families, and pushed for legislative changes to prevent future tragedies. Miguel's story also began to be used as a case study in medical and nursing schools, an example of how empathy and humanized care are essential in any healthcare setting. Clara was invited to speak at conferences, where she shared her experience and stressed the need to prioritize patient lives and well-being above all else. As the years went by, the Miguel Foundation became a powerful force in the fight for a fairer and more humane healthcare system. Clara, despite the pain she still carried, felt a renewed sense of peace as she saw her brother's legacy flourish. Miguel was not just a victim of a flawed system, he became a symbol of resistance and change. The tragedy that nearly destroyed Clara ironically, gave her a new mission in life. She continued to lead the foundation with unwavering determination, always remembering her brother and what he represented. And in every victory, in every change achieved, Clara felt that Miguel was by her side, his fight living on through her and all who followed her. The hospital where Miguel had been treated was eventually reformed, with new stringent policies implemented to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again. But Clara knew that this was only a small part of a larger fight, a fight she was determined to continue. And so, as life moved forward, Miguel's name remained alive, a beacon of hope for all those who believed that a fairer and more humane healthcare system was possible.